Dr. Vanessa Harper stepped into the small courthouse with a quiet air of confidence she had mastered over the years she had spent navigating predominantly white spaces with grace and dignity. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor as she made her way to the front, where she was greeted by the bailiff, who directed her to the defendant's seat. She took her place and folded her hands in her lap, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of recognition, but no one seemed to notice the subtle power she carried in every movement. The courtroom buzzed with the usual mundane cases, but Dot Harper was no ordinary person. This was a small traffic infraction. She had been caught speeding in an area she was unfamiliar with while rushing to a meeting that could have been postponed, but she had no intention of making excuses. She believed in the system and trusted it would handle this situation just like any other minor violation. Judge Carlton Stevens, an older white man with a sharp suit and a set of glasses perched on the end of his nose, took his seat at the bench. He had been presiding over cases like this for decades and saw nothing unusual in the woman sitting before him. At first glance, she looked like any other professional who had made a simple mistake and who could afford to pay the fine without hesitation, but there was something in the way she carried herself that caught his attention. Dr. Harper kept her voice steady as she explained the circumstances surrounding the ticket. She did not try to over-explain or plead her case too forcefully, but instead spoke with the confidence of someone who had been in control of her own destiny for a long time. She wasn't seeking sympathy, just a fair decision. Her words were measured and precise, but Judge Stevens did not seem to appreciate her calm. He listened briefly before glancing at the clock on the wall. It was a busy day for him, and he was ready to move on quickly. His response was swift, and without much thought, he announced the fine, which was higher than what was typically expected for such an infraction. The decision was final and delivered without much empathy. Harper raised an eyebrow, but did not protest. She had learned long ago that some battles were not worth fighting in the moment, and so she simply nodded, accepting the ruling with the grace she was known for. The tension in the courtroom hung in the air for a moment, but Dot Harper's composure seemed to diffuse it. She stood and walked out of the room with the same calm confidence she had entered with. As she made her way to the exit, a few people in the courtroom glanced at her. Some whispered to each other about the high fine, while others remarked on how she seemed unbothered by it all. But no one knew the true significance of the woman they had just witnessed in the courtroom, and so she left as quietly as she had arrived, unaware that this seemingly ordinary day would become something much larger and more consequential. As Dr. Harper stepped out of the courtroom, the door clicked softly behind her, marking the end of what seemed like just another routine appearance. Her heels echoed down the narrow hallway, and she couldn't help but glance at the clock on the wall. She was running late for another meeting, but she didn't let the pressure show on her face. She walked with purpose, her every step a testament to years of navigating complex spaces and challenges. She had faced bigger obstacles, far more significant ones, than a small traffic ticket. Judge Stevens sat at his bench, adjusting his glasses and preparing for the next case. As his gavel struck again, he moved on to the following defendant without a second thought. His mind, trained to handle hundreds of cases, didn't linger on Dr. Harper. To him, it was just another day, just another fine to issue, just another face in a crowded sea of people. He was focused on keeping the docket moving swiftly, the courtroom running on schedule. Little did he know that his decision that morning, though seemingly inconsequential, was about to have ripples far beyond the courthouse walls. Dr. Harper's case had been one of many, but there was something about her presence that lingered with him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about her demeanor stood out. It wasn't the kind of forceful presence that some attorneys or clients might carry into the courtroom, demanding attention with loud voices or exaggerated motions. It was quieter, more assured, more composed, but still impossible to ignore. Yet in his haste to move through the morning's cases, Judge Stevens had barely processed her words. He had dismissed her explanation too quickly, and in doing so, he had dismissed her value, and her potential. When he announced the fine, his mind was already on the next case. He hadn't truly thought about the amount or the fairness of it. To him, it seemed like a reasonable penalty, and he delivered it with the precision of someone who had done this countless times before. But as the sound of his gavel echoed in the room, He didn't anticipate the immediate consequences of his decision. Outside, Dr. Harper's calm departure was noticed. People who had been in the courtroom, some of whom knew her face from the news or from her influential work, began to exchange quiet glances. The whispers started small, but quickly grew louder. They murmured about the fine, questioning why such an amount had been imposed on someone who clearly didn't fit the mold of a typical defendant in a traffic case. Some of them even began to speculate about her identity, her professional poise, her quiet dignity. They knew they had seen that before. But where? Back in the courthouse lobby, a few attorneys who had heard about Dr. Harper's appearance started to ask questions. They too, like everyone else, had missed the bigger picture. Was she someone important? Someone they should know? They were so focused on the trivial details of the case, what she wore, how she spoke, that they didn't bother to investigate who she really was. They didn't realize that Dr. Harper wasn't just another person in a courtroom. She was a woman on the verge of history, a legal scholar whose influence reached far beyond the walls of that courthouse. Judge Stevens, meanwhile, had moved on to the next case, still unaware of the storm that was brewing. The day went on as usual, but a subtle shift had already occurred. Dr. Harper's quiet departure from the courtroom marked the beginning of something bigger, though neither she nor the judge could see it yet. Both had unknowingly set the stage for a series of events that would change their lives, and possibly the course of American history. But for now, they were two people on separate paths, each unaware of the other's true importance in the larger narrative that was unfolding. As Dr. Harper exited the courthouse, the murmur of conversation in the hallway grew louder. The air felt charged, and people couldn't help but glance at her as she moved past them, her head held high. She was graceful, unbothered, and seemed to carry an energy that felt different from the usual defendants who entered the court for minor infractions. Her demeanor was composed, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she walked, a subtle yet powerful presence that immediately caught the attention of those around her. Several people in the hallway exchanged looks, unsure whether they had seen her face before. The name Vanessa Harper seemed to ring a bell, but it wasn't clear from where. One by one, a few attorneys who had been in the courtroom whispered to each other. They hadn't paid much attention during the case, thinking it would be another routine traffic violation that would go by without incident. But now that she had left, the small group began to speculate. There was something about her that felt important, something about the way she spoke and carried herself that didn't match the usual defendant. She didn't appear like someone who would be caught speeding in a small town. It's weird, right? She doesn't seem like the type to end up in court for something like that, one of the attorneys remarked, his voice low, as if trying not to be overheard. Another nodded, squinting as Dr. Harper made her way toward the exit. I feel like I've seen her before, but where? Maybe on the news. She looks like someone who's got real influence. The conversation grew quickly, fueled by curiosity. Soon whispers spread through the courthouse about the poised woman who had just been fined. But it wasn't just idle gossip. The attention turned to a more serious line of questioning. Who exactly was Dr. Vanessa Harper? A few minutes later, one of the bailiffs pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly through an online newsfeed. The name caught his eye. Vanessa Harper, Supreme Court nominee. The bailiff's eyes widened in disbelief. No way that's her, he muttered to himself. Without wasting another second, he shared the information with a few colleagues standing nearby. One by one, the story began to spread like wildfire. The woman they had all just seen in the courtroom wasn't just an attorney or a well-known figure. She was someone who had been nominated to the highest court in the land. The news hit like a thunderclap. Within minutes, the local news stations were broadcasting the story, and soon, the broader media picked up on it. Dr. Harper, the woman who had just been dismissed so casually by Judge Stevens, was a trailblazer, a force in the world of law, and someone on the verge of being confirmed to the Supreme Court. The revelation shocked the people who had been in the courtroom, many of whom hadn't given her a second thought during the proceedings. On social media, people reacted with a mix of disbelief and anger. How could the judge have been so dismissive of someone like her? Many asked. Doesn't he know who she is? The comments flooded in, many pointing out that Dr. Harper's calm acceptance of the fine, despite the fact that it was higher than normal, was a testament to her grace under pressure. Meanwhile, Dr. Harper continued about her day, unaware of the firestorm igniting around her. She had long since left the courthouse, heading straight to her next appointment, her mind focused on the work that lay ahead. But what had seemed like a minor and inconsequential encounter in a courtroom was about to become a defining moment in her life and the life of the nation. Judge Stevens, still oblivious to the unfolding story, continued his duties, unaware that he had just been part of an event that would soon spark national conversations on justice, bias, and how society perceives power. The whispers in the courthouse would soon turn into full-blown headlines, and the public would soon learn just how much they had underestimated Dr. Vanessa Harper. The news about Dr. Vanessa Harper spread like wildfire, quickly capturing the attention of local media outlets and soon the national press. It didn't take long for the truth to hit. The woman who had just been fined in a small courthouse for a minor traffic infraction was not just a typical defendant. She was a highly respected legal scholar, a trailblazer in her field, and most notably, she had been nominated to the United States Supreme Court. The revelation stunned everyone, from the courthouse staff to the public at large, who had been unaware of her identity. The initial reaction was one of disbelief, followed quickly by a surge of curiosity. People began to question how such an important figure could have been treated so dismissively. Social media exploded with discussions. News outlets began to report on the story, quickly piecing together the details of Dr. Harper's career. Her accomplishments were extraordinary. She had published landmark legal papers, worked on high-profile cases, and advocated for justice reforms in ways that had earned her admiration from colleagues across the nation. Yet here she was, casually dismissed by a judge who hadn't taken the time to understand the depth of her significance. As the details of the case came to light, people quickly began asking how Judge Stevens, a man with decades of experience, could have missed such an important detail. The more they learned about Dr. Harper, the more questions emerged about the fairness of the decision. Was it possible that Judge Stevens had overlooked her not because of the case, but because of her identity? Her gender? Her race? The more people looked into the specifics, the more they questioned whether this incident had been the result of a simple mistake, or whether there were deeper systemic biases at play. At the same time, news outlets began to highlight Dr. Harper's composure in the face of it all. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't argued with the judge, hadn't fought the fine. She had simply accepted it with grace, unaware of the ripple effect that would follow. Her reaction to the situation only amplified her public image as a woman of incredible poise and strength, and it didn't take long for her story to become a symbol of resilience. But for Dr. Harper, who had spent years facing challenges of a different nature, this incident was a minor blip in the grander arc of her journey. She didn't expect a spectacle. She didn't seek attention. Her focus was on the work that lay ahead, the path toward her Supreme Court nomination. While the public buzzed with commentary, Dr. Harper went about her day, quietly confident in the importance of the mission that awaited her. She understood that the courtroom encounter would soon fade into the background, but the questions it raised about justice and bias were bigger than any single moment. Meanwhile, Judge Stevens was left grappling with a growing sense of disbelief and regret. He had been informed of the true identity of the woman he had fined, and the revelation hit him hard. As an experienced judge, he had prided himself on fairness and impartiality, yet now he wondered if he had been blinded by unconscious bias, his snap judgment clouding his understanding of who Dr. Harper really was. He tried to reason with himself, telling himself it had been an honest mistake, that he had no idea of her significance. But the weight of the moment sat heavily on him. How many others had he misjudged, failed to fully see, or underestimated? The days following the incident were filled with questions, not just for Dr. Harper, but for the entire judicial system. How could something like this happen? And how could it be prevented in the future? People from all walks of life voiced their concerns, from legal professionals to everyday citizens, wondering if unconscious bias had led to the wrongful treatment of someone who had long earned her place in the highest echelons of American law. The fallout from Dr. Harper's encounter in the courthouse would prove to be far-reaching, but in a way that no one, least of all Judge Stevens, could have anticipated. It would spark a deeper conversation about fairness, bias, and the way people of color, especially Black women, are treated in spaces of power. And for Dr. Harper, the storm of attention was just the beginning of a journey that would take her from a small courthouse to the highest court in the land. But first, she would have to navigate the newfound spotlight with the same grace she had shown that morning, knowing that her actions would now be under an even brighter spotlight. As the days passed, Judge Carlton Stevens found himself unable to shake the nagging feeling of guilt that had settled deep in his chest. It wasn't the first time in his career that he had made a decision on impulse, but this felt different. This wasn't just another case to clear off his docket. It had become something much larger, something that would forever linger in his thoughts. He sat in his chambers late one evening, his fingers absently tracing the rim of his coffee cup, staring out the window into the dimming sky. He couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Vanessa Harper. The more he replayed that moment in the courtroom, the more it troubled him. He had been too quick to impose a fine, too eager to move on to the next case. He hadn't even taken the time to truly listen to her, to process her words. But it wasn't just her words that mattered, it was who she was. Judge Stevens had always prided himself on being fair, on giving each defendant their due time in the courtroom. He prided himself on the belief that the law should be blind to all but the facts of the case. But as the days wore on, he began to question whether that had truly been the case with Dr. Harper. He had dismissed her so quickly. Had he seen her simply as a Black woman in a suit caught in a minor legal issue, and not as the accomplished legal scholar and Supreme Court nominee that she truly was? The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that bias, however subtle, had played a role in his decision. It was a bitter pill for the judge to swallow. He had prided himself on his experience, on the number of cases he had presided over without incident. Yet here he was, questioning the very foundation of his work, wondering if he had allowed preconceived notions to cloud his judgment. Had his actions been based on her appearance rather than her words? Had he been influenced by the very biases he had worked to overcome in his career? Judge Stevens thought back to his own upbringing. He had grown up in a small town where people like Dr. Harper, the highly educated, the successful, the poised, were often out of reach, viewed from a distance, and rarely acknowledged for their true worth. Perhaps in that moment, he had unknowingly fallen into an old pattern of thinking, one that he had tried to leave behind. But bias, he realized, could be insidious. It could slip into the smallest corners of even the most well-meaning minds. The next morning, after much deliberation, he sat at his desk, pen poised over paper, drafting a letter. He knew that words alone wouldn't undo the damage he felt he had caused. There were no simple apologies for a mistake like this, but he felt a responsibility to acknowledge it nonetheless. He had to do something to make it right. He started with an apology, not just to Dr. Harper, but to the public, to everyone who might have seen this incident as a sign of something much deeper. His letter was humble, reflective, and honest. It acknowledged his mistake without excuses. He admitted that he had failed to see Dr. Harper for who she truly was, and that his quick judgment had been a disservice to her, to the law, and to the principles of fairness he had always championed. As he signed the letter, Judge Stevens felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't enough, he knew that, but it was a start, a first step toward recognizing his own biases and confronting them head-on. He knew that this wasn't the end of the conversation, it was only the beginning. There was much more work to be done, both for him as an individual and for the entire justice system. The reflection, the acknowledgement of his mistake, was the first step in what he hoped would be a broader journey toward fairness, equity, and understanding. And while the road ahead was uncertain, Judge Stevens knew that he could no longer pretend that his role as a judge had only to do with interpreting the law. His decisions, no matter how small, impacted real lives, and those lives deserve more than just a quick judgment. They deserve justice in all its fairness and complexity. He only hoped that Dr. Harper, wherever she was, would understand that his apology came from a place of genuine remorse, and that his own moment of reflection would lead to real change, not just for him, but for the entire judicial system. Meanwhile, Dr. Harper continued her work, aware that her life had shifted in ways she had never imagined. The incident in the courthouse had become part of her story, and though she wasn't one to dwell on the past, she knew that this moment would spark larger conversations about race, about gender, and about the ways people are treated based on who they are and how they appear. She had no idea yet just how powerful these conversations would become. But the ripple effects of that courtroom encounter had only just begun to unfold, and Dr. Harper, as always, was ready to face whatever came next with grace, strength, and an unwavering commitment to justice. As the days passed, the story of Dr. Vanessa Harper's encounter with Judge Carlton Stevens continued to dominate news cycles across the country. What had initially been a small courtroom incident, one that seemed to be a mere footnote in the daily workings of the judicial system, was now front and center in public discourse. The courtroom's dismissive treatment of a Supreme Court nominee, particularly a black woman, sparked outrage. The media, public figures, and advocacy groups weighed in, each offering their own perspectives. But the core question remained: how could something like this happen? The scrutiny of Judge Stevens intensified. He had been a fixture of the local judicial system for years, known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. But now, the very qualities that had once earned him respect were being questioned. His quick judgment, his failure to recognize Dr. Harper's identity, and his lack of empathy were all scrutinized. It became clear that the issue wasn't just about one judge's actions. It was about the larger, deeply ingrained biases within the legal system. In the public's eyes, Dr. Harper became a symbol, not just of resilience, but of the challenges that black women in positions of power faced every day. Her poise and dignified response to the situation was praised, but the underlying message was clear: how many other qualified women and people of color had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated in similar ways. How many times had someone's worth been judged by their appearance, or their gender, or their race, rather than their accomplishments? Advocacy groups quickly seized the moment, calling for a re-examination of how the legal system handled cases involving women of color. They argued that this incident revealed a glaring issue that went far beyond Dr. Harper's individual experience. It was about systemic problems that affected countless others who never had the same platform or attention that she did. The calls for greater accountability were loud, and they spread quickly across the nation. Meanwhile, Dr. Harper found herself thrust into the media spotlight. She hadn't asked for this attention, but it was impossible to avoid. Every news outlet wanted an interview, every journalist had a question, and social media was ablaze with discussions about her. Though some of the attention felt overwhelming, she handled it with the same grace and poise she always had. She made it clear that the story wasn't about her, at least not entirely. It was about the larger issues that needed to be addressed, the biases that she had spent her career fighting against, and the need for change within the judicial system. In a carefully crafted statement, Dr. Harper spoke about the need for accountability in the legal system, for a deeper understanding of the biases that shaped decision-making at every level. She pointed out that while her experience was far from the worst-case scenario, it was emblematic of the everyday struggles that people of color, particularly black women, faced in professional spaces. We live in a world where our worth is constantly questioned, our qualifications constantly doubted, based on things that have nothing to do with our abilities, she said. It's not just about one judge, it's about the entire system. This needs to change. Dr. Harper's words resonated with people from all walks of life. Her message was one of both personal strength and social justice, calling for introspection and real change. But as the public conversation continued, the focus increasingly turned back to Judge Stevens. Was his failure to recognize Dr. Harper's significance a result of unconscious bias, or was it a deeper, more systemic problem within the court system? Was this an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of treatment that people of color, especially women, experience in the legal world? The pressure mounted on Judge Stevens. He had initially thought that the story would blow over, but now it was clear that the questions surrounding his actions weren't going away. The media demanded answers, and people across the country were calling for some form of accountability. The judge had already written his letter of apology, but it was becoming clear that a mere apology wouldn't be enough. The damage, it seemed, had already been done, not just to Dr. Harper's reputation, but to the very ideals of fairness and impartiality that the legal system claimed to uphold. For Dr. Harper, the attention only fueled her resolve. She had long known that the road ahead would be difficult, being a black woman in a field as historically white and male-dominated as law came with its challenges. But now, with the eyes of the nation on her, she was more determined than ever to see this through. Her nomination to the Supreme Court had always been about more than just her career. It was about creating space for others who had been marginalized, for those who had never been given the chance to rise to the top because of biases they could not control. But as she looked ahead to the confirmation hearings that loomed, Dr. Harper knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice, the fight for equity, the fight for a fair legal system would continue. And she would be at the forefront of it all, just as she had always been. The weeks following Dr. Vanessa Harper's courtroom encounter saw a wave of media attention that surged into every corner of American life. What had initially been a local courtroom mishap was now a key moment in the national conversation about race, gender, and systemic bias in the legal system. The fallout from the incident escalated just as Dr. Harper's confirmation hearings for the U.S. Supreme Court approached, a once-anticipated event now amplified by the scandal. Her confirmation was already a historic event, a breakthrough moment in American legal history, as Dr. Harper would be the first black woman to sit on the nation's highest court. However, with the revelation of her courtroom experience, the stakes felt even higher. It seemed everyone was waiting to see how Dr. Harper would handle the public scrutiny. How would she respond to the critics who had attacked her presence in the courthouse? How would she handle the voices that now called her credibility into question? But for Dr. Harper, this was another test in a long line of challenges she had faced throughout her career, and she had no intention of letting the circus of public opinion derail her. The confirmation hearings began with the usual array of questions, but it was clear that the incident in the courthouse was weighing heavily on the minds of those in the room. Senators from both parties referenced it, some with genuine concern, others with a pointed agenda. They asked Dr. Harper how she felt about the treatment she had received from Judge Stevens and whether she believed her experience was indicative of a larger problem in the judiciary. Dr. Harper maintained her composure throughout the questioning, her answers as poised and thoughtful as ever. I understand that my experience has raised important questions about fairness and bias in the legal system, she said, her voice steady. But this moment isn't about me. It's about the ongoing challenges faced by many in the legal system who are too often dismissed based on their race, gender, or background. If anything, I hope that my story can serve as a reminder of the work we still need to do to make our courts truly equitable. Her words resonated with many, but there were also those who sought to discredit her, citing the incident in the courthouse as evidence of an overblown reaction. Some insinuated that Dr. Harper's public outcry was a strategic maneuver to garner sympathy, questioning whether her experience had been exaggerated for political gain. They tried to frame her as someone who was using her position as a nominee to fuel an agenda, yet Dr. Harper responded with dignity, never losing her focus on the broader issues at play. In a moment that would later go viral, Senator William Hayes, a conservative voice on the Judiciary Committee, directly asked her, "Do you believe that a judge's personal opinion on the appearance of a defendant can impact their judgment in the courtroom?" Dr. Harper paused for a moment, letting the weight of the question sink in. Her eyes met the senator's, and then, with deliberate calm, she responded, "I believe that the law should always be impartial, but we must recognize that no one is free from biases, whether conscious or unconscious. It's crucial that we, as judges and legal professionals, work to acknowledge and address those biases. No system can claim true fairness if it is not rooted in a constant examination of the ways those biases show up." The room fell silent. It was a bold statement, one that demanded the senators to reflect on their own biases as much as the broader justice system. Dr. Harper's words became a powerful rallying cry for those advocating for change, reminding everyone that the fight for a fair and just legal system was an ongoing battle, one that required constant self-reflection and reform. As the hearings progressed, it became clear that Dr. Harper's confirmation was no longer just a political event. It had evolved into a broader conversation about representation, equality, and the very foundation of American justice. Her calm, rational approach to the situation had won the respect of many, even among those who initially questioned her. She wasn't just advocating for herself, she was advocating for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed by the system. And while the process was far from over, Dr. Harper remained steadfast. The public scrutiny, the biased questioning, the political games, it was all part of the journey. She knew this moment wasn't about a single courtroom incident, nor was it solely about her appointment. It was about a turning point for the country, one that demanded a broader examination of the structures that shaped its legal system. Dr. Harper had always known that her path to the Supreme Court would be difficult, but now, more than ever, she was determined to see it through. She was no longer just a nominee. She had become a symbol of the need for change, a beacon for all those fighting for justice, equality, and the recognition of their worth. And despite the challenges, Dr. Harper stood firm, ready to take her place on the nation's highest court and continue her fight for a better, more equitable future. The day Dr. Vanessa Harper received her confirmation to the Supreme Court was nothing short of historic. Despite the controversies, the intense media scrutiny, and the public debates about fairness and bias, she had navigated the storm with the grace and composure that had become her hallmark throughout her career. As the final votes were cast and the Senate voted overwhelmingly in her favor, Dr. Harper became the first Black woman to ever serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, a monumental achievement that was celebrated by people across the country. Her confirmation was more than just a personal victory. It was a moment of reckoning for the American judicial system. It was a statement that the voices of those long marginalized had a rightful place in the highest courts of the land. Dr. Harper had shattered barriers, not only for herself, but for future generations of women and people of color who aspired to change the face of American law. However, even as the congratulations poured in, Dr. Harper knew the journey ahead would not be without challenges. The weight of her position on the Supreme Court would be immense, and the road to true justice would be long. She had always been acutely aware of the significance of her appointment, understanding that her place on the court would represent much more than just a career accomplishment. It would be a symbol of what was possible when individuals and communities that had long been overlooked finally have the opportunity to step into positions of power. But Dr. Harper was not one to rest on accolades. She was determined to use her platform to address the deep-seated issues within the judicial system that had first been exposed through her encounter with Judge Stevens. Though the judge had apologized and the incident had sparked an important conversation, Dr. Harper knew that the work was far from done. In her new role, she would have the power not just to interpret the law, but to reshape it, to advocate for reforms that ensure justice for all Americans, regardless of their race, gender, or background. On her first day as a Supreme Court justice, Dr. Harper walked into the courtroom with a sense of purpose. The chambers, often filled with the weight of history, seemed to hum with the energy of possibility. As she took her seat among the other justices, she felt a profound sense of responsibility, but also a renewed hope that the justice system could one day reflect the true ideals of fairness and equality that had been promised to all Americans. Her first case as a justice, a complex matter concerning voting rights, would set the tone for her tenure on the court. She approached the case with the same meticulous care that had defined her career, analyzing every detail, listening intently to the arguments presented, and searching for a solution that would ensure the rights of marginalized groups were protected. As she read through the briefs, she was reminded of the countless people who had been excluded from the democratic process, who had fought for their right to vote only to be disenfranchised by systemic barriers. She knew this was one of the many battles that had yet to be won. During the deliberation, Dr. Harper made her voice heard. She emphasized the importance of ensuring that the law adapted to the changing needs of society, that it served everyone fairly, regardless of their background or identity. Her perspective, shaped by her own experiences and the broader struggles of the marginalized communities she represented, was invaluable to the court. Her arguments, filled with empathy and a deep understanding of the issues at hand, added a fresh and necessary perspective to the deliberations. The decision in the voting rights case was one of the first in which Dr. Harper played a pivotal role. It marked the beginning of her legacy on the court, a legacy that would be defined by her commitment to justice, equality, and a relentless pursuit of fairness for all Americans. Her impact on the court was undeniable, and though she faced criticism and challenges from various quarters, her resolve remained unwavering. Dr. Harper's appointment to the Supreme Court wasn't just about one woman breaking through barriers. It was about transforming the very systems that had long excluded people like her. She had always known that real change would take time, but now, with the weight of history behind her, she was prepared to make that change a reality. Every decision, every case, every argument would be an opportunity to build a future where justice was truly blind, not just in name, but in practice. As she walked out of the court that day, Dr. Harper reflected on how far she had come. From that courthouse, where she had been unknowingly dismissed, to the highest court in the land, she had proven that the system could evolve. Her journey was far from over, but now, more than ever, she was ready to face whatever came next with the same dignity, strength, and commitment to justice that had defined her every step along the way.